Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are, and welcome, a very warm welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First. I'm Robert Hall, the Executive Director of Resilience First, and together with Bina Chester, our Director of Operations and Communications, who is working the platform in the background, we will be overseeing the event today. By way of a quick introduction, Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resiliencefirst.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and application of resilience. We've recently formed a strategic partnership with Resilient Shift, so we hope our reach and output have expanded for the greater good. Now, today's webinar marks a departure from our usual format. We will be conducting this session in the style of an Oxford Union debate, with you being the virtual audience. While heckling and placard waving will be difficult, thankfully, we do hope that you will engage as fully as you can from your location, as without your participation, the event will be less lively and interesting. The motion this afternoon is, this House believes that our resilience standards are not up to standard. So before we go through the procedure for the debate, let's first take a sounding of your initial view of this proposition. If we could have the poll up, you will now see a poll which I hope you will press either yes or no, and I'll give you a few moments to register your view on screen. So please indicate your choice and we will conduct it again at the end. Thank you. So after the voting, let's go through how we are going to run the debate this afternoon. Firstly, I will introduce our chair for this afternoon, who will kindly give some opening remarks. The chair is Claire Ward, who's the Chief Executive of the Institute for Collaborative Working. Welcome, Claire, and thank you for stepping into the hot seat. The chair will then introduce our first speaker for the afternoon to begin the debate, who will be Dr. Chris Needham-Bennett, who's the Chief Executive of Needham's 1834. And Chris will speak for the motion. The chair will then introduce and call upon the next speaker, who is Rob McFarlane, Deputy Director of Civil Contingency Secretariat at the Cabinet Office. And Rob will speak against the motion. The chair will then open the debate by inviting questions or comments from you, the audience. As the audience, you have two ways of participating. You can either ask questions or make comments throughout the session by entering your remarks in the chat box to the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, you can raise your virtual hand, which will indicate that you would like to come on screen and make your comment directly. And we will select a person who's put the hand up to come into the box and ask that question directly. The chair will draw on the questions and comments from both and invite the participants to pose that question. And I would ask, whether it's in the chat box or on screen, please do keep your questions brief and succinct, because we only have 15 minutes for the overall discussion. So if you're not, then others will be denied their opportunity. At the end of the session, the chair will invite the speakers back into the floor to give their rebuttals to one another's remarks, brief rebuttals, and then we will conclude with the remarks from the chair and give you the opportunity to vote once again to see if you've changed your mind as a result of the persuasive arguments from the two speakers. And the chair will announce the result of that. Lastly, I will say that the proceedings are being recorded and we will share an edited summary and the slides used in the debate in the next few days. So with those rules and procedures out of the way, I hope they work for you. I'll hand over to Claire. Claire, the floor is yours. Let's begin the debate. Thank you.
Hello. Well, thank you very much, Robert. And I'm delighted to be chairing this debate today, and to do so from the perspective of an interested but impartial viewpoint. For those of you who have seen my biography, I hope I don't have to call order, order. I'm sure our speakers and our participants will indeed be well behaved. The Institute for Collaborative Working, of which I'm Chief Executive, is an associate member of Resilience First, and this is a mutual arrangement reflected in our own institute. For those of you unaware of the ICW, we are a cross-sector membership organisation, both individual and corporate, with the purpose of supporting people, organisations and business to understand the value of collaboration and the benefits achieved from structured collaborative working. We have an interest in standards too, as the thought leader behind the methodology, which forms the core of the first global standard for collaborative working, ISO 44001. For those of you who want to know more about us, please do get in touch after today's event. So today, our focus is not on collaboration, but on division. So just as the House of Commons, on which Oxford Union debates are based, divides on a motion, we will do so virtually today. And we have taken the mood of the audience already, so we can see how much or how little you are persuaded by the arguments and the debate that you hear today. I'm really interested to see the comments and the diversity of the people who have joined us today, and I can see that you're a very global audience too, which is a fantastic result for Resilience First. So now we need to listen to our speakers for and against the motion, to set aside your initial views and to consider whether our speaker in favour of the motion makes the case on the balance of probabilities that this House believes that our resilience standards are not up to standard. We know that standards have an impact on all of our lives, for good or bad, but this debate is not on the generality of standards, but on the specific issue of resilience standards. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce the speaker for the motion. Dr. Chris Needham-Bennett is the Managing Director of Needham's 1834 Limited, the company he established in 1996. His work experience includes board-level strategic training and consultancy, commercial security work with the Home Office, private finance initiatives, and a background of military service in the Parachute Regiment and at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. With a keen interest in risk and resilience, together, I think, with some cynicism for standards, as he tells me, Chris is going to set out the case today for the motion. Over to you then, Chris.
Thank you. Your last point was the most telling there. I'm speaking here as a cynic, and a cynic is a frustrated perfectionist. It is not somebody who's denigrating the enormous amount of hard work that all the technical committees, all the contributors to the standards, all the accrediting bodies do every single day, giving up their time and working incredibly hard to have some standards. What I am arguing today is that for fundamentally 4 reasons, the standards have become not up to standard. That doesn't mean they're bad. If you take Mo Farah, he's not a bad runner. He's just not up to the standard to go to the Olympics. And it's my cynicism that drives that desire for perfection, that they can be made better. But first of all, or secondly, I should say, welcome to my dining room. I've rarely had so many people in the dining room at once, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the debate. What I'd like to do as well is to establish our own credibility. My company was one of the first to gain certification to ISO 22301. I've attended the BSI's lead auditor course, and we have had the standard since 2012 with no non-conformities at all since then. So I am a big fan of the standards, but they can be better. In other words, they're not quite up to standard. Robert, could I just have the slides up if I may? Thank you. 4 points, just 4. They're too complex, they're not scalable, and they are of questionable utility, and inherent because of those 3 factors, they have several adverse consequences. I'll deal with these in order. The first, they're too complex. If you go back to the BSI, British Standards Institute Royal Charter, Section 3, a riveting good read, but it says very, very clearly that the aim of standards is to reduce management systems complexity and to make it simpler. And simplification is key to the wording of that Royal Charter. Now, what's happened since then? Everybody has contributed something. And here's a snapshot. You can see the majority of the resilience standards on the top left. It goes from the business continuity through to guidelines for exercises, through to incident preparedness. Depending on what business you're in, you can then add a number of other operational risk standards to complement those. And if you Google risk on the ISO website, you wind up with 890 results on 28 pages, including, you can see there, the risk assessment for sports and other recreation facilities and equipment. It seems that we've become obsessed by standards, and inherently we've made things more and more complex. Imagine, if you will, being new to this discipline, looking for standards to attain and finding all of this. Now, some of it's helpful, some of it's not, but there's arguably too much and too much complexity. Now, I'm not going to go even into the details. If you take 22301, you look at sections or clauses 7.2, 7.3, awareness, competence. They are simple in their statements, but they're massively complex when you actually come to apply them. Add to that all the other criteria that's burgeoning, and you have a recipe for complexity which is at odds with the original Royal Charter of the Standards Institutes, which is echoed by the ISO Standards Institute as well. So I hope I've made the first point, that they are becoming over complex, and by becoming over complex, they're not up to standard. The next one, this is a lovely graph, and those of you who are mathematically inclined will very quickly realize that because this was drafted for a parliamentary briefing, the cumulative sum of the businesses comes to 101%, which makes it a rather novel sort of a graph. Nevertheless, it serves a purpose. If you look, 96% of UK companies, that historical precedent said by Adam Smith and Napoleon, that we are a nation of shopkeepers. We are a nation of micro employers, 0 to 9 people in 96% of companies. Only 0.1% are large companies. Yet, the business continuity resilience standards that are available are, by their own definition, a one-size-fits-all. And I ask you to consider, if standards are up to standards when they apparently apply equally to a company like mine, which is a micro company, in comparison with Rio Tinto, huge multinational mining company. My contention is that it's just not credible to have one size fits all. It would be the madness of Marks and Spencer's making one pair of trousers in one size and saying, well, it fits the average person. We have to develop, to bring the standards up to standard, we have to bring in some degree of scalability. Just look at the administrative burden, even for a small or medium-sized company, in attaining ISO 22301 as an example, combined with all the other standards that are complementary to it. They don't have the ability to do it. It is difficult. It is time-consuming. It diverts from core business, admittedly. It has benefits, yes, but they're potentially disproportionate to 96% of UK companies. So I hope I've achieved making the second point, that the standards at the moment in their current incarnation are not scalable for the majority of UK companies. And therefore they require revision, they require amendment, they require development. There are great claims to the utility of standards. And I've taken these from the BSI's own website. I haven't made them up, they're the BSI's claims. And here you see a rather interesting notion that standards are responsible, standards broadly, not just resilience standards, but they're responsible for 28% of improved GDP. However, if you compare that with the Office for National Statistics graph there, you can see that actually there's been a decline in GDP. So a lot of the utility that is claimed for standards to be effective seems to me to be fundamentally not underpinned by proper peer-reviewed academic research. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's just fact check it again with the BSI Group's own statistics. 48% of companies surveyed reported a net benefit from standards. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that means that 52% didn't report a net benefit. If these are meant to be an endorsement of standards broadly, then they fail. And part of the reason for that, I contend, is that there hasn't been an incorporation of academic rigor into the analysis of how the standards are actually applied and the benefits derived thereby. In 2018, 3 Germans made an academic survey of the scientific literature underpinning ISO standards. Scientific literature only appears in 1/4 of the standards. That means that you would be taking a vaccine based on something, a percentage that is barely above placebo level. We need to bring scientific rigor to the standards to improve the standard of them and their reliability. That's not to criticize what's being done. It's a fantastic start point, but it's increasingly not up to standard by any measure of scientific rigor. It also brings with it unintended consequences, and this is an example of them, where people can achieve standards through non-accredited businesses and take shortcuts. You can't divorce yourself from the unintended consequences. Similarly, one might have expected Category 2 responders under the Civil Contingencies Act to purposefully attain 22301 or 25999 as it was. What do? Because of the administrative burden inherent in it, they move away from that and have developed their own business continuity management toolkit so that they can align with it and thereby discharge their obligation. But this is evidence that ISO 22301, as an example of a resilience standard, is too bureaucratic, too demanding of a complex organisation like the NHS, and therefore it needs further revision. Finally, the numbers, the sheer numbers. This is taken from Cambridge Risks data. You can see there that valid certificates rose 12% to 1,690, of which 305 are UK. Now, that may sound quite persuasive. I believe it's just the opposite, because if you do the statistical analysis, if you ran companies at random and said, have you got 22301, they would only be 1,000 times more likely to have actually been struck by lightning. So despite the fact that a number of companies have it, it is a minuscule percentage of UK companies, and therefore we need to amend the standards, make them more simple and more accessible. Ladies and gentlemen, my 10 minutes is virtually up. I believe and hope that I've made the case. The evidence against the standards being fit for purpose is that they're too complex, not scalable, have no proven academic utility, and inherently there have been several adverse consequences where people have avoided adopting them because they're too bureaucratically demanding. Many thanks for your attention. I look forward to hearing from Rob shortly.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your case in favour of the motion. And I'd now like to invite our next speaker against the motion. Dr. Rob McFarlane is Deputy Director in the Cabinet Office Civil Contingencies Secretariat, where he has oversight of resilience doctrine, standards, training and assurance. Before joining the civil service in 2006, Rob established and led a geospatial analysis consultancy for 10 years, running projects from post-conflict reconstruction in Mozambique to renewable energy planning in the Western Isles of Scotland. Rob is one of the authors of the Joint Emergency Services Doctrine and has led the development and subsequent revision of British standards on crisis management and organisational resilience. He was awarded an OBE for public service in the 2021 New Year's Honours List. Rob, if I can invite you now to join us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. If I could just ask for the slides to come up, I'd be very grateful. Thank you. Smashing. Thank you very much indeed, Robert. I do need to start with a caveat, which is that I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. I am a civil servant. I also represent, I do not work for, but I represent British Standards Institution as a chair of the Technical Committee for Societal Security Management. So in the interest of disclosure, I make both of those points, but I do need to be clear that I'm speaking in a personal capacity here this afternoon. So that out of the way, please, if I could have the next slide. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, a little bit of a swerve. I don't make this for a sort of a tactical avoidance reason, but I'm talking about standards more generally. I realise that the premise of this debate centres very much on BSI and our European and international CEN and ISO standards, but I think we should go wider than that. And if we're talking about standards, we should acknowledge that there are a variety of different standards out there. So my position in this debate is clear. So how did I arrive at this view? Well, I've worked on both technical and organizational interoperability for a good number of years now, initially in post-conflict reconstruction, working with multiple international non-governmental organizations. And that experience left me with a firm belief that having common, and I emphasize that point, common ways of working is a good thing. It certainly beats, under all circumstances, having no common way of working. So that was quite a significant sort of pillar, as it were, of where I am coming from. As my career has gone on, that work has evolved on working on interoperability issues pertaining to the emergency services and also further academic study. I'm quite a nosy person at heart, so I kept going back to university on issues around safety and interoperability. And that left me with a more, not entrenched, but a firmer view that standardized ways of working generally do matter. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much indeed. So I've mentioned why I think issues around standardized working matter. And just to explain some of the graphics there, safe systems, the word there, the picture there is of a book that draws out the importance of having standardized terminology, not just in the aviation industry, but more broadly in safety critical systems. Literally how we talk about things can save lives or it can cost lives. Psyllium sticks up at the top. There is a well-documented example that in historical practices in emergency services, what would be understood by a red psyllium stick by the ambulance service would be a critically injured patient. And you might use one of these things in a difficult working environment where it's dark and dusty, etc. You need to identify somebody who is a most critical casualty. A red psyllium stick could also be used by the armed forces to indicate a potential improvised explosive device in the same bit of geography at the same time in the same event. So these are clear examples where we're working across boundaries. If we do not have common ways of working, common ways of talking to each other, let us call that interoperability, then bad things can happen, and happen very quickly with terrible consequences. Earlier on in my government career, I became quite fastened on the view, arising from the experience I've just talked about, that consistency matters greatly. I've moved on, I might say grown up a little bit, to a view that consistency matters greatly in some areas, but coherence matters absolutely everywhere. And I think that does bear on standards, but there are of course different types of standards. So there's a couple illustrated at the bottom of that slide there. Recognisably a British standard, which I led the development of on crisis management, but also a set of resilient standards which I'm responsible for from UK government around local resilience forums. So just to the different types of standards, specification standards they're relevant to where consistency matters. So back to my earlier point. But guidance standards, that different sort, where most of my professional experience has been with, is where principles and good practice matter. Things that are much more inherently transferable between contexts. And then of course there's the broader range of government, inspectorate and regulator standards as well. And my case that I tried to make to you this afternoon rests on these different types of standards. Now, where you sit determines where you stand. So much of that is true, and a lot of my work is getting bits of the system to work effectively, but also effectively together. That is part of what we do in government and the public sector more generally. I freely acknowledge that is less of a concern in other contexts. As I said, where you sit determines where you stand. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much indeed. I quite often have military personnel attached to my team at work, and one person who's currently here is a pilot, flies the Tornado, and he's introduced me to the acronym TABS, which I'll get to in a second. Now, on the point of solidity and rigidity, I don't think many of us would argue that having a solid foundation for what we do and what we do together, back to the common foundation thing, is a bad thing. I think we hopefully most agree that's a good thing. But equally, I think most of us would agree that rigidity has a tendency to break. And it's interesting that pilots have got this motto, which is TABS, stands for, if you'll pardon me, a mild bit of swearing, there's always bloody something, brackets, goes wrong. Now, to that point, and I do think this is quite important because we're talking about resilience standards, we define, I go back to my point about language, we define resilience in terms of continuity, but also adaptability. It's about getting through the short-term stuff. It's about adapting to longer-term changes as well. And I think that bears on what we need standards to do. If they lock us into a position of not being adaptable and being unable to reflect to and morph with the changes of the environment, then I think they take us to a bad place rather than a better place. There is an adage that one should work with handrails rather than handcuffs. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. A concession. And I realise I probably shouldn't be making concessions this early in the debate, but hey, there is, I think, with standards thinking more generally, there is a danger of, if not necessarily a race to the bottom, then at least to a race to the sort of the middle of the field. I would counter that. In actual fact, standards can be, and indeed should be, progressive. The Moscow framework is one that I draw on a great deal. We can specify, standardise what we must do. You can identify what we should do. You can describe what we could do. The prescriptive, the normative and the indicative, and that represents a ladder to climb. Now, I'm in danger of agreeing with my opponent, so I should move quickly on. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you very much indeed. My last slide. So getting back on track, it's a reference, of course, to the oft-quoted starting point for BSI and the disagreement between the great rail builders of Stevenson and Brunel over rail gauges. Taken for grantedness. When I went back to university, in 20 years after leaving one for the first time, my tutor would talk about this term taken for grantedness. And it struck me as sort of academic wiffle waffle and not really making any sense. But the more I reflected on it, the more I thought that it's actually very, very relevant to crisis management, because if people do promise you something and they fail to deliver, then you don't just lose a bit of confidence, you lose an awful lot of confidence. And that seems something that all of us in the risk and crisis business should be very mindful of. False assurances are dangerous. They need to be reliable. And there's a really important point there about standards, which is, frankly, if they are not up to scratch, then we are undermining so much of our improvement activity. So they have to be exceptional pieces of work. So I finally arrive at my central point, which is, if you are going to ask how good you, we, or they are in a resilience context, then you simply cannot do that without standards. You need some articulation of what good looks like, what progressively better looks like, and standards can be both yardsticks and ladders. Now, having used a military example, but my opponent has served and I have not, was probably a foolish idea, and I'm going to compound that given the background and the nature of the adjudicator by quoting Churchill, which democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So to close. Standards and the means by which they are developed are imperfect. I will not defend the indefensible in that regard. But I think rejecting standards entirely as a driver for coherence and improvement is to throw the baby thoroughly out with the bathwater. And we're at a moment where we should look back, we should look forward, and acknowledge the necessity to think how we can do better. I will close there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both our speakers. And I'm very interested now to sort of pick up on some of the points that have been raised in the chat and the issues that have been raised. And perhaps I can invite both our speakers to maybe put on their cameras and we'll have a little bit of a debate here. So picking up on perhaps an issue raised by one of our contributors, Mark Armour, the issue of whether the standards are adaptable or do they simply entrench an existing methodology and make it difficult to be flexible? What say you, Chris?
I think they have a tendency to, and again, because this is a debate, I'd offer evidence for that. Increasingly, the BCI good guidelines are seen as the criteria by which auditors judge the business impact analysis or the risk assessment or the other elements of the ISO standard. Now, I think that the two should be distinguished. You have an auditable standard, you have a good practice guide. And notice it's a good practice guide. It is not biblical in nature, it is not God-given, it is a guide. And I think when you have a standard, there is a propensity for people to add to it. They never take away from it. It's a bit like legislation, I suppose. They never take away from it. They only ever add to it. And I think it's that creeping excellence of adding things to it, adding definitions, adding criteria, however subtly, through the audit process. Allegedly, I would say, in terms of adding value, or allegedly in terms of continual improvement. But the effect is to make it immeasurably more difficult for companies in practical terms. Because a very small change in a very large company takes an awful lot of work to push through to an auditable standard. That's roughly.
Rob, would you like to respond to that?
Would it be possible to hear the comment in question again? I do apologise. Thank you.
Okay, so what we're looking at is the issue of adaptability. Are standards allowing for adaptability and the flexibility, or are they simply entrenching an existing methodology?
Thank you very much indeed. I think there is a danger of that. There's no question. There's no question about that. I mean, there's almost a sort of a danger of the streetlight effect. You know, the old thing about why does a drunk look for his or her car keys under the streetlight, because that's where it's illuminated. And there's a tendency to describe things in close detail where we understand them, where it's easiest to do so, and that can apply, I think, to standards. And there is sometimes a comfort in great detail. It is sometimes easier methods or write a process than a set of principles. But I think, and I am echoing part of what Chris said here, I think there's a point here about standards are inherently plural. Some are, and there's that whole thing about, to a person with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And if we try to apply very prescriptive approaches to all contexts, then they will simply fail. And I would draw a distinction there between business continuity and crisis management. Now, maybe starting a new set of hairs running here. But business continuity, I'd argue, is something that lends itself more to more prescriptive statements. Crisis management, crises are, if we know anything, they are inherently uncertain, ambiguous, and you feel your way through. They are things where you need principles. So I do think that the answer to your question lies in there is not one size fits all, and individual standards should be adopted and adapted in any given context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're getting some comments in the chat room now from our audience. I don't know whether or not some of them would like to come on and ask a question, and if they do, perhaps they can indicate by putting their hands up. But perhaps in the meantime, I'll ask a question that we've had in from Flavio Nascimento. Given the importance of good principles in architecture of systems, why don't we have simulators widely available so that we can simulate and compare different options before committing to a very expensive implementation? Rob, perhaps we can start with you.
So I absolutely agree with you on the value of simulation. I think whether you are new to a field or you are an expert, and there are of course various slightly facetious definitions of what constitutes an expert in your field, then practice is something you should never ever cease to do. So as a means of learning individually and critically collective, then certainly simulation in its broadest range of contexts. Where I am nervous is where fidelity of simulation becomes almost an end in its own right. If you think about exercises, then they're like a toolbox, they're not an individual tool. And we absolutely need to work out what is the right tool for either exposing issues, assumptions, or what have you in a situation, and the structures built to deal with it, and taking it through to confirmation. So whilst I, at a level of principle, absolutely agree with you, that simulations as a means of testing and rehearsing our understanding, our assumptions, and our arrangements for dealing with things is inherently a good thing to do, then I would say that that technology, which I may be reading you wrongly, feels slightly implied by your question, has a place, but it is not a universal requirement. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, I wondered is it possible to take the slides down now? Or?
The slides are down on my screen. I can just see pictures of
probably just one. Okay, no problem. Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by simulation, and it depends as well whether you're looking at critical decision making or whether you're looking at simulating a larger, longer process. I think the two are slightly different. You can have a very good test of decision making with relatively little information, because quite often at the start of any incident, be it business continuity, crisis, whatever you like to call it, you'll have very little information on which to base your decisions. So I think at the lower end of it, you can have some very, very effective simulations with relatively little technology. You don't need masses of technology to put people in a thinking dilemma, which is partly what it's all about. If you then take it further, it sounds to me almost like you're suggesting that you could almost Monte Carlo model a number of different outcomes through a simulation to see which was the best process. Now, if you take that strategy, I would again applaud it, because it's highly effective. And in many respects, that's how the first atomic weapons were developed. They modeled a lot of different outcomes and moved some variables around, saw what happened. So I would commend both the simple approach to it and the more complex. In terms of simulators being available, I'd be interested to know from the questioner where you think this would be funded.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have an opportunity for him to speak to us, but I am going to be joined, by the looks of it, by Mark Armour, who has had quite a few comments in the chat room. So, Mark, can I ask you to make a brief question, please?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Excellent. So Chris raised a very important point early on, that there's no academic research that I've found that actually demonstrates that conformity to standards delivers improved outcomes in terms of better outcomes when things go wrong. And as you discussed, this leaves us using conformity to standards as the means by which we measure resilience programs. Isn't this kind of the most fundamental problem with resilience standards today? And is there a way to overcome this?
Perhaps we'll start with you, Rob.
Yeah, delighted. Thank you, Mark. So I'd make a couple of points in relation to this. I would suggest, as somebody who's had a split career, working in both academia and consultancy and also in government, that there are multiple sources. I would not, whilst I would recognise absolutely the importance of academic research, I think we would be wrong to say that there aren't other legitimate reference points, very important reference points for understanding effect, which is what I think we're ultimately talking about here, impact. To the second point, I think it's going back to my point about streetlight, really, the streetlight effect. It's dead easy to describe, relatively easy to articulate standards about what you do and what you have. That is fairly straightforward. You need to train people in activity. You need to have certain things: contingency plans, business continuity management. What you really need is to then get into the business of what doing them really well looks like. And that is where the different sorts of standards, become helpful. You can have guidance standards which articulate, from A to Z, from soup to nuts, this is what doing them well looks like. But I think one of the things that I know I've grappled with over quite a long period of time is in the UK, we used to have an organisation called the Audit Commission, which drew out a very long established and hardly novel distinction between inputs, outputs and outcomes. And measuring inputs, relatively straightforward. Outputs, pretty straightforward. Measuring outcomes, really quite difficult. And I think in the resilience context, where so much of what we do is riven through with uncertainty, then actually assuring inputs is quite straightforward. Assuring outputs is fairly straightforward. Assuring outcomes, where things are potentially a once in a lifetime, once in a career, or once in 100-year period, is incredibly difficult. So I think one of the real challenges for future standards is thinking about things that are tools for assuring the conditions for, against which you can assure the conditions for a better outcome. And there's a substantial conceptual, methodological and practical challenge in getting away from measuring stuff and describing activities to actually demonstrating doing those things very well with a heightened confidence of a better outcome. And that feels like a big challenge for standards. Thank you.
I'll bring you in, Chris, before we go to one of our audience members.
Yeah, briefly, quite clearly, you're absolutely right. You can't do a blind or double blind trial on a standard and its application during a crisis. You just can't do it, because you can't split your company and say, right, you've got no plan, you haven't got the ISO, you have, and you've got a placebo blank sheet of paper. It's just not going to happen. What I see is that you can do some research, and I would encourage the standards organizations to commission that sort of research, where you could investigate, just in simple, semi-structured interviews with people who've been through it, what was the help of the ISO, where was it beneficial, where was it not. You could gain statistical value from that, you could gain significant benefit, and I think that is something which I would love to see, because I believe it will improve the standards, and it'd be relatively easy to do. And I know that there's a lot of universities, if they were funded to do that, would absolutely love it.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mark, for your question. We'll be going shortly to Russell Price, who's going to join us for a question. But interesting, there's been a huge amount of comments also around this general scalability issue and how resilience standards can be supported in general. So are there any comments you want to make on some of those? Whether or not they, let's just see, do you think resilience standards should become more risk agnostic considering more cascading effects and complex events? And that's from Gianluca. Maybe you want a quick comment on that, Chris, before I go to one of our other speakers.
I have to declare an interest because I've written a paper with Gianluca. I know exactly where he's coming from. He's from UCL, by the way. So I'm sure he is saying something there which I entirely agree with. So I'd hand it back to Rob.
Rob.
So on the point of things being risk agnostic, and this kind of goes to Chris's earlier point about the proliferation of standards, in principle, I absolutely agree. A lot of the work that I've been involved with, whether it's around guidance or whether it's around standards, actually emphasizes generic capabilities. Now, we would define a capability as an ability to do something. I mean, that's not the most elegant definition, but at least it's short. But the full definition would be of capability a demonstrable ability to do something to defined levels under specified circumstances. The defined levels is your standards bit. Under specified circumstances, you need some sort of risk parameters around it. But the word demonstrable kind of links back to my previous point, that actually standards against which you cannot say I'm here or here or here really have, I think, failed, no pun intended, to miss the mark. So I think in principle, absolutely, the vast majority should be standardizing what you need to be able to do. And I would not be in favor of a substantial proliferation of risk-specific standards. There may be requirements where they're needed. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm still waiting for one of our audience to join us. So perhaps I can read out some other comments. So Melina Maniva, you can be aligned to ISO 22301, but end of the day, it's up to the lead auditor who will either accept the evidence or provide recommendations. That is subjective. There can be gaps and room for improvement, but a day or two in assessment does not fully review if the standard fits your business model. It is surely attractive to investors. Any comments you want to make on that, Rob?
Yeah, happy to. It's something that I've given quite a bit of thought to, on methods and data. So if we think about assurance as a chain of events where you need common foundations, we need to have some sort of conceptual and terminological consistency. We need standards that people, both the subject and the assessors, actually adhere to. But your points about methodological consistency, or at least reliability, and evidential standards, if that's not misusing a policing term, are absolutely vital. And I would say that if you had, and I'm sure there's some benefit, some possibility to do some controlled experiments here, different outcomes for the same organization displaying the same characteristics at pretty much the same time, but a different auditor coming in, then the system at some point is flawed. So as much as we can do to standardize practices around methodology, how you conduct your assessment against standards, and also evidential standards, what good really looks like when you're demonstrating in practice, the more we can standardize around that, the more I would be a happier person. Thank you. Okay,
so I think we're going to move to rebuttals now. And Chris, you're up first. If you can draw this to a close and present your case at the end now, so that we can move on to a final poll to gauge the outcome of your arguments. Chris?
Yes, I understand I've got about 5 minutes for this, have I?
Yes.
Right, okay. I'm not going to attack in any way what Rob has said, because there is absolute validity in everything that he's mentioned. And I take virtually no issue with it. In fact, I find the majority of his arguments faintly supportive or complementary to my own. And I know that we're both dedicated to making things better, not denigrating what has been achieved. I'm risking sounding like the Spice Girls here. What I want, what I really, really want, is back to that scalability issue. If you look at most companies, even up to medium-sized companies, that's up to 250 people, 20 million plus turnover, they've still got limited resources. They've still got pretty tight budgets. Now, there seems to me to be a number of fundamental standards which apply to them. There's the ISO 9000 standard, the quality standard, there's the risk standards, there's the resilience stroke business continuity, howsoever defined standards, there's the 27001 IT audit standards, and arguably the supply chain, because everyone's got, almost everyone, I'd hesitate to find a company that didn't have those. So what I would love to see is some work done to have a simple and scalable standard where you can turn around to some of these companies and go, right, fine, we've combined the critical elements of these. We're not saying you've got quality in every aspect. You've got quality in this aspect. You've achieved that standard of risk management. You've achieved that due diligence in your supply chain. Say, turning around saying, right, show me evidence that you have audited your top 10 critical suppliers to 2 tiers. It might be as simple as that. Now, if you bring this back to years and years ago, my father and I went to buy life jackets. I was age 6. He turned around and he actually introduced me to the British Standards Institute because he said, I want a life jacket that has passed the British Standards Institute. And that life jacket, when fully inflated in a sea state of 3 feet, would turn a fully grown person weighing 14 stone onto their back, raise their head above the water within 4 seconds of immersion. Now, the life jacket for me was different. In fact, it wasn't a life jacket because that standard was what defined a life jacket. Mine was a buoyancy aid because they didn't make life jackets for children my size. The buoyancy aid still had a British standard, but it wasn't a life jacket. So being positive, as opposed to saying what's wrong with the standards, what we should be looking at is something that combines economically efficiently some of these things which people aspire to, that can be attained, as Rob was saying, in a very standard sort of a way, which reflects the scalability between the companies. That's what I'd like to see in the future. I'm not taking anything away from what's there, but at the moment, my final contention is I urge you to look in your heart of hearts. If you're not enjoying ISO standards, they are also not up to standard. So if the enjoyment isn't there, it's like the gambling analogy. When the fun stops, stop. Please vote that standards are not at the moment fit for purpose, but the corollary is that they can be made.
Thank you, Chris. And over to you now, Rob.
Thank you. So if the only success I achieved this afternoon is moving Chris to a position that standards are not at this position in the insertion in the title of the motion, then I will take that. 3 points around complexity, proliferation and scalability. On complexity, I don't think standards have to be detailed. Well, not all of them do. Some of them do. My colleagues in my day job think I have a deep and abiding loathing for staples because I like things to be on 2 sides of one piece of A4. And many of the standards that we've developed from a government point, no, not many, every single one of them does fit. So I think, there is, to quote and probably misquote Oscar Wilde, the difficulty is in writing a short letter. And I do think, at the pinnacle, there is a room for standards that are brief, they say what they say, and then exit. There is, of course, a need for supporting detail. So I don't think standards necessarily have to be long. I don't think they should be complex. Under proliferation, Chris, you and I have both spent years of our life gaining doctorates, and one definition of that process is getting to know more and more and more about less and less and less. And we need people like that, back to agreeing with each other, I think. But to sort of link that across to proliferation, then I do agree with you. I think there are dangers in proliferating, but sometimes we do need to know more and more and say more and more about less and less. So I think it's a question of having some sort of hierarchy of these things, where maybe there are higher, sort of more capstone level standards that are then sort of supported. So on the point of proliferation, I'm not going to speak against proliferation per se. I'm going to say I think we all have got a better job to do in linking these things together. In standards, we very often just list other cognate standards. I think we need to do more in actually specifying how and why they are pertinent to each other. And to the final point on scalability, I take your analysis around the inaccessibility of standards for SMEs, but I'd link that to the previous point, that they don't have to be complex necessarily. Now, in a lot of our work in government, we draw a distinction between capability, the ability to do something, and capacity, how much of that thing you should do. And we are very, very non-specific about capacity. because that is a locally contextualized decision. The Highlands and Islands are profoundly different to the home counties of England, and how much of things you need and how frequently you need to do certain things is context dependent. So I don't think that standards are inherently irrelevant. In actual fact, I'd argue the converse, which is that the principles laid out in standards and the imperatives that underlie them, which are fundamentally about creating the conditions to survive and thrive as an organization, a community, an entity, an element of infrastructure, all of those things matter as much to SMEs, and by aggregation and implication to all of us nationally, that our job is not to accept that standards may be hard to reach, but actually tilt them in a manner that they are more relevant and less scary. So I think there's a point there about those capabilities are required in all organizations. The capacity is different. Maybe we need to tell that story in a more powerful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to both of our speakers today, but also to our audience who have been engaging in quite a lot of debate on the chat room, asking each other questions and challenging each other's points as well as yours. So now we're interested to see whether the debate has actually changed your views. And when we started this, the poll in answer to the question, are resilience standards fit for purpose? You answered 25% yes and 75% no. So can I ask you to vote now on the poll? It's just been opened, and let's see whether this debate has changed your minds at all. It's still moving, that poll, at the moment, I can see. And we've certainly got a great attendance here today. So that's being reflected, I'm sure, in the time that it's taking for so many now to poll. Please ensure that you're voting so that I can find the final results for you. Well, I'd say that we need to probably end the poll now because I'm conscious of the time. And you've had a little bit of an impact, Rob, certainly in that debate. So now we've got 28% who think that the resilience standards are fit for purpose. So you've shifted 3% of our audience. So well done to Chris for winning that debate today. But I'm sure that the actual discussions and the questions that have been raised will certainly stimulate people to think more about the impact, not just of resilience standards, but standards in general. I'd like to thank you for your participation and hand back to Robert.
It's been great debate. It's the first time we've tried it, and I think it's been very successful. I would like to thank not only the chair, who held it together very well indeed, and the two speakers who gave a really good performance on their both parts, but also the participants. As Claire said, you really engaged with this, and delighted to see that. So all it leaves me really to say is that we would love you to join our next debate, which is on the 14th of September, when we'll be launching a guide on re-emergence and resilience for SMEs, based on work we've undertaken with Facebook and Russell Cook solicitors. So I do hope you can join us. So once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, the speakers. Thank you, the chair. Stay safe and goodbye.